Well, hey guys, welcome to today's episode, and I am so stoked for you to listen to this. If you're a dad, this is a special episode for you. It is Father's Day week that this is going out, and we have the privilege of talking to Justin Whitmel Earley, who wrote a book called The Habits of the Household. Now, I don't know about you, but I have often wrestled with knowing how can I incorporate spiritual training, discipleship, formation of my daughter, and soon to be my son as well. Let's go. But I just always thought, how do I do this in a way that doesn't feel like another thing to add on to our daily task list? Well, Justin just talks about habits of the household and how we can incorporate discipling our kids. And I'm just going to tell you, man, it's beautiful stuff. And so if you're a dad, you need to listen to this and hear all that Justin has to say. Justin is an author, he's a lawyer, and he's a father to 4 boys. And I just really think you're going to appreciate what he has to say. Let's jump in. Well, hey, Justin, it is so good to have you on the podcast today. Man, to be honest, your book has been such a blessing to me and my family as I'm a new dad. And so I just want to say thank you for coming on the podcast today.
You're so welcome. I appreciate that. I'm glad to hear it.
Well, Justin, listen, I can't, typically I don't do too deep of an introduction, but I just need to hear how you ended up becoming from a missionary in China, and now you're a lawyer writing books about habits for parents. How did that happen?
By way of crisis. So I've always loved writing, so that's important to note. I've always been a writer in some respect. But I was a missionary in China for almost 5 years, had a real calling experience in China where I felt called to the vocation of law. Maybe subject of a different podcast, but I really did feel called to live missionally within the vocation of law. And then I ran at that vocation with all the fervor of a missionary, so to speak. So I just sort of drove really hard through law school in my first year of lawyering at being good at it, at doing what other top law school students did, at being the young, ambitious lawyer. It's funny that even as a former missionary, I didn't really think about at the time that I was totally assimilating to the habits and practices of law school and young lawyering, which you can imagine are not healthy. And so as it turns out, what happened was that I had a major collapse my first year of lawyering, which was, I use the words now. I didn't know what it was then, but I use the words now of anxiety attacks, panic attacks, just sort of a mental and emotional collapse. But it was so bad that there was a stretch of time where I wasn't able to go to bed at night without pills or having a couple glasses of wine. Like right. The question was, how did the missionary become converted to the nervous medicating lawyer really so quickly? And that was the major thing that led me to write and reflect on this. Now, it took years, honestly, like a year to get better and then years to reflect on it. But what I've learned in the wake of that time and through what the Lord has done in my life since was that I was converted from the missionary to the nervous medicating lawyer, not by somebody explaining to me the worldview of lawyers and how you need to earn your identity through work. No, I was just converted by habit.
Right.
That worldview came sort of settled down into my heart just through the habit. And so ever since, in my first book called The Common Rule was kind of about this story and what I learned about daily and weekly rhythms. What I learned was that your heart follows the habit, and to really, really follow Jesus in the way the fullness of the faith calls us to. It's not just a head project, it's also a habit project, and that's how you really get a hold of your heart, by aligning your habit in your head. So I've been all about ever since really thinking about aligning the habits of our practices to the worldview and the faith claims that we have. And starting to see the heart as what follows in the wake of that.
Yeah, man, you do something really interesting. A lot of my peers, when I was a youth pastor, a lot of my young adult peers, they just loved your first book. They ate it up, and I think there was this real passion for like monastic traditions and spiritual rhythms.
Yeah.
But I've never seen them paired with habits. And I just thought, man, that's a great combination that kind of you have a reflection kind of work with. One thing I noticed in reading your book that I thought was really cool, you open it up with just the most relatable story of where this book, Habits of the Household, came from.
Yeah.
And when I read it, I thought, man, I'm only like 18 months in to fathering, and I feel like I already understand some of the themes you're going on. I mean, yeah. So tell us a little bit about where this book in particular came from, and just kind of that moment that was a bit of an epiphany for you.
Yeah, well now I tell people I'm 2 for 2, right? Because the second book also came out of a sort of crisis as well. So and it's neat. Like, I'm not making this up just for the podcast. This is sort of an integrated story of life. I mean, I feel like what I write about is what the Lord is teaching me as I live. And as I lived another year or two after publishing my first book, I really started to think about the question of how does this apply to my children and my family. I mean, I'd already been thinking about sort of communal rhythms, but not specifically in the realm of parenting. And that sort of came about after a very typical night. And I don't even remember when this was. I remember the night, but like it was a typical night in our house. At the time I had 3 boys. Now I have 4. But it was just a crazy bath time. People were escaping the bath. People were throwing toothbrushes. They were throwing board books. They were wrestling naked on the floor after bath. I'm trying to get them in pajamas. They're not listening. I begin to threaten bodily harm for their not listening. And like, and I just like did what I usually do and started like flying off the handle and yelling everybody to bed. And, I finally like give them a short bedtime prayer, tell them I love them, close the door. And it was just one of those nights where I stood by the door and had this hallway epiphany of, this is not good, but it is normal. And that had to settle in for a minute, because it was like, I'm doing what I always do. And I think we all have these sort of epiphanies sometimes where we don't just realize that didn't go well. We realize that never goes well. And that's like a signal of what your ordinary is, right? And as I was talking through this with one of my pastors later, as good pastors do, they help you realize that like you know the problem, you just haven't said it yet. And that was that I had done all this thinking about, liturgies in my tech life and in my work life and in my just like my own weekly and daily rhythms. And I had, right smack in the middle of my parenting life, this sort of liturgy of anger that was happening on a daily basis of like, this is how I get the family from point A to point B. I yell them there. I shout them there. I control them. And so he challenged me to start using a bedtime liturgy with my boys, and thinking in those terms, which of course like was humbling because I was already thinking in those terms in so many other places in my life. But never underestimate your blind spots. That's what sanctification is for. Like the Lord will, which I just want to say, actually, footnote for a second. That's a sign of grace, that you can continually be loved by God and yet called forward to the next step. So I didn't even feel bad about this as much as like, oh my gosh, like there's more that the Lord has for me. And so
thank God for good pastors, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm forever thankful. And this pastor's name is Derek. And so what happened after that was I wrote my own little bedtime liturgy for the boys. I'll say it with you really quick so that readers can hear it. So
sure.
What I wrote was this short Q&A of I ask questions and they answer yes. And so I would just say, can you see my eyes? They would say yes. Then I'd say, can you see that I see your eyes? They say yes. Then I say, do you know that I love you? Yes. Do you know that I love you no matter what bad things you do? Yes. Do you know that I love you no matter what good things you do? They say yes. And then I end with, who else loves you like that? And they say, God does. And then I'll say something like, rest in that love or go to sleep in that love. And as sentimental as that might sound as I just said it, as you can know with 3 small boys, like this was total chaos the first time doing this with them. The eye thing was like extremely bewildering to them. They're like poking my eyes and like, or like, do I love you no matter what bad things you do? They're like, no, you do not love me when I do bad things, clearly from your actions. So like, but this is such an important part because as we talk about habits of the household, nothing is normal in the house until it is. But families, this is classic family. You can make the weirdest things normal in your house. You're already doing it. Like if anybody looks into your house, they'll be like, oh my gosh, you got all these rhythms. You might not know what they are, but if somebody looks at or comes to your family, dinner, they'll be like, oh, you do all these things. Like the family is famous for making weird things normal. So you can make nice, like almost awkwardly specific moments like this normal within a short span of days if you just put the intention in to do them. And I did. I knew enough to know that like you have to start a habit for it to become a habit. And then this ended in a really beautiful moment a week or two later, where one of my sons asked for their bedtime blessing, and I gave it to them. And it was just a sweet moment that was an island of a sweet moment in an otherwise like completely chaotic night. Like it was still the same bathwater on the floor, still the same fights with the toothbrushes, but I had changed. Because I was now moving towards that bedtime liturgy moment and not towards the I just need to get to them to bed. And that's when it really clicked for me that this is the power of a good parenting habit. You know, circumstances are the same, but you act differently because you're now hooked into different rhythms. And I see those sort of like hooks of grace. Like the Lord uses these moments to change how we respond to our children and change how they respond to us out of habit. And that's where you really start to grow into something more than just the chaos of your old ordinary. You can create new patterns of grace, which I would call gospel liturgies if we want to get fancy.
Yeah, I man, there's so much I want to unpack in there, just liturgies and habits. And the one thing I really appreciate about what you just said, though, is how when you are doing these habits, it changes how you kind of walk into situations. And I think about even in your first book, when you talk about like trying to do kneeling prayer 3 times a day, right, in the morning, in the midday, in the evening, I thought, man, how would my day look differently if I began on my knees praying to the Lord, and then I go out and take on the chaos of breakfast? Like it just changes the game when you're walking in that intentionality. Now, you've mentioned the word liturgies a couple times. For those that are listening that maybe are saying, man, I thought liturgy was that thing that my friend at the Anglican church did. Like, you know, I grew up in a bit of a Pentecostal background, and when I went to a university and people would talk about liturgy, and I'm like, oh man, we don't do that in the Pentecostal church, right? So tell us a little bit about what you mean by that, and just how amazing it is to have gospel-centered liturgies in your own home.
Yeah. I'd like to open up that word to invite everybody to understand that they're already doing liturgies. That's the point. Now, some of my really high church friends, particularly some of my Catholic friends, have pushed back on this a little bit, and they're like, you're watering down the definition of liturgy. I see their point, because they see liturgy as the capital L liturgy of like the things the Catholic Church does. But even that, like, it's like too in the weeds. What I think, and what I think most people think liturgy is, if you stop and think about it, is it's the, semi-conscious, sometimes even unconscious patterns that we do over and over in order to worship the God who we believe in, right? So if you're in a non-denominational church, this might be just that, like, you always start with that 10 minutes of songs, and then you go into a sermon, and then you have Q&A after the sermon, and then, like, it's just, like, you might not call it liturgy, but these are the like, you'll know if for some reason you didn't start with songs of worship. Like, something's different,
This is just what we do. Right?
Yeah, it's what we do. And we do it for a reason, at least originally. Like, we want to draw you into worship, then we want to feed you with the word. Like, all of this is good. The point is, liturgy's intended, we pick these orders in our life, and then throw in like Wednesday night small group, or like your Sunday night prayer service, or whatever else you have in your church or your small group. These things are chosen intentionally because we want to become more like God. Like, these liturgies are supposed to shape us. These rhythms are supposed to shape us. If I said your rhythms of worship, you would kind of get it, right? What I want to tell people is take that definition of liturgy, and then just think about the definition of habits. Habits are the things that we do over and over, semi-consciously to unconsciously, and like I just told in my story, they're the things that form us, whether intentionally or not. Our heart follows the habit. So the only difference you have between the definition of liturgy and the definition of habit is one admits that it's about worship. Habits, of course, are still like involve our worship. They just obscure what we worship. And so what I'm trying to get people to do when I reference liturgy in their daily life is just suggest the way that you respond to your kids in a moment of disobedience, that way that you always do it, that's a liturgy leading you in the worship of something. The way that you always wake up and look at your smartphone and go to that website or this website, that's a liturgy leading you in the worship of something. The way that you always respond to that client email or that new work project or that employee who's not doing it exactly right, these are places where in our quote-unquote ordinary life, extraordinary spiritual things are happening. We just haven't named them yet. And I want to name them by using liturgy and say we should be examining all areas of our life, technology, work, and specifically in this book I'm talking about habits of the household, to say, how would we create gospel liturgies in the household so that our kids don't just hear us proclaim the gospel in words, though they should. They also feel that gospel reenacted in the story of bedtime, or reenacted in the moments of waking up, or reenacted in our moments of meal times. These are the things that form our children much more than the words that we say. So that is a major issue of spiritual formation in the house.
Yeah, the whole idea of taking the moments you're already doing and just like kind of reframing them as liturgies is so powerful. I think about how I try most days when I come home, my daughter and I go for a walk around our property, and
Nice.
like right now we just do that. Like it's but there's not that liturgical habit behind it, and so it's like, man, how can I reframe this moment that we do already to be gospel centered and a spiritual formation moment? Or, after dinner when we tickle, and I know you talk about like some of the blessings you can do even just as you're tickling your kids and stuff like that.
Right.
Would you mind just talking about that one in particular, about just them experiencing the joy of God? And
yeah, I mean, like, everything that you just said, for example, is a great point I want to emphasize, in that what I am not talking about is adding like 1 million moments of like family devotion and prayer necessarily into your life. I'm all about family devotion and prayer, by the way. But what I'm not talking about is adding all these things that you're not doing already, and you feel burdened by all these new things that you need to do. What I'm talking about is opening your eyes to the things you are doing, and maybe being thankful for some of them, and being like, hey, on that idea that you take a walk with your daughter every day when you come in from work, that's an amazing relational thing. You actually are. There's a liturgy there of relationship, and you could like be thankful for that and say, oh, I should keep doing that, and maybe lean into like, what are some typical questions we can ask on this walk as she grows older? What are some like prayers we could say together in that moment? And then you can look at other moments of the day where you bedtime was my example, where things don't go well, and ask what are some little habits that you could put in almost as escape routes for me. I'll just be honest, Jordan, like for me they're escape routes often for my anger and frustration. So like, let's say bedtime, and I'm trying to do a bedtime blessing or just get them to bed, and they're not listening, and I got like two options. Like I can do the anger thing and yell them to bed, or I can tickle the heck out of them and just have them like totally surrender in laughter, and like remind. And so lots of times, if bedtime's not going well, or if they're not saying the right words to the other bedtime liturgy, or just something else, like I'll just be like, let me give them we'll call it the tickle blessing, and I'll like literally threaten it in a funny way. I'm like, I'm gonna give you tickle blessing, like you're gonna get it if you keep this up, and then I'll start tickling them and say something like, may you laugh for joys all your days, and may the Lord be with you, amen. And like they love, and they'll ask for this blessing often. Like they'll be like, can we do tickle blessing tonight? I'm like, sure. So it's just there's a lot of ways where I think you look for these moments to say, how can I reclaim relationship with my kids in this moment? In relationship with God in this moment, in the areas where I would otherwise be violating it by yelling or being absent from God. And these are like, they sound silly. They are. It's tickling. And yet it's so meaningful that I can develop a norm of being like, I'm not going to yell at you. I'm going to laugh with you. Totally. And have the same outcome, like the same desired outcome of like, now it's bed, now you're in bed.
Yeah, man. I just like that changed the game for me, because I think oftentimes when I read books, I always feel this inclination. I need to do more, I need to implement this program. But in reading your books, there just seemed to be this capitalization on the things that are kind of already happening. How can you reframe? Because I think so many fathers in particular, all of our listeners for the most part are men, already feel like they're just surviving.
Oh, yeah.
It's just like, I'm gonna get home, we're gonna do dinner, we're gonna get them to bed, and then we're just gonna clean up and rinse and repeat. And so the idea when you hear guys say like, oh, make sure you're doing family devotions, or what curriculum we're using or whatever, it can feel so burdensome on men. What would I just think that's such a good point to say, already look around. What rhythms are you already doing that you can kind of put Jesus at the center of?
I mean, and I just want to like talk straight to the listeners here. Like, I know you're tired and burdened. So am I. Like I not that this is a contest, but like, I run my own law practice. I write some books on the side. I have 4 boys who are like some of the wildest and like most rambunctious boys that I've met in my, it's really hard to hold everything together. But what I'm telling, and like, I know you're listening to this and your life is like that, like you're tired, you're exhausted. What I'm suggesting is not more stuff you have to add on. What I'm suggesting is that doing nothing is the most exhausting thing that you could do, because
Yeah.
you're accepting all the unconscious habits of the life you inherited, or like the cultural current that you're swimming in. And these are the things that drove me into my anxiety collapse. Literally, by
Yeah.
doing nothing, I went along with the current. And we know what the current in the Western world is. It's towards mental illness. It's towards depression. It's towards anxiety. It's towards alcohol abuse. It's towards suicidal thoughts. I mean, it's towards this fraying of existence. But Jesus says, "My yoke is easy and my
Yeah.
burden is light." So by saying I want to find these moments of my regular day where I can bring in these gospel liturgies and work and technology and family, you are literally doing less, and you are actually accepting the easy burden of Christ. So this is
Yeah.
freeing. This is not
Yeah.
burdensome.
Not to mention even like the sanctifying piece of this, right? Like we often think we're doing these things so our kids grow up to be like nice adults and follow Jesus when they graduate high school. But when we do this hard work of parenting, and just, although it may seem hard at the beginning, when we establish these habits, it's not only like shaping our kids. What ends up happening is through this parenting process, we become shaped ourselves. Is that something you've
Absolutely.
seen? Yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, I I think it's important for every father and mother, but I think we're mostly talking to fathers here. For every father to reimagine parenting as a task where they primarily are the child. So, yeah,
Yeah.
and what I mean by that is the task of parenting is less about what you're doing in your kid's life and more about what God is doing in your life.
Wow. Can you say that again? Sorry, I need you to just say that again. That was beautiful.
Yeah, so the spiritual task of parenting is less about what you are doing in your child's life and more about what God is doing in your life.
Wow.
And just think about a moment of discipline, for example. I hear them fighting over the Nintendo Switch controllers upstairs, and I'm trying to get dinner ready or write an email that I'm behind on, whatever.
Right.
I, I am interrupted in my task, and I am furious. So I go up to yell at them about what? About two kids fighting over a Switch controller, and why are they mad? Because one interrupted the other in their task, so they're fighting. So now we're literally all doing the same thing. I'm
Yeah.
just, mine is justified because I'm the parent. Like, I can yell at you for interrupting me, but you can't yell at each other for interrupting each other. So like, which is like, one of the things that's happening in that moment is that God is trying to parent me and say, don't yell at your kids just because you feel inconvenienced by their misbehavior.
Wow.
Instead, Justin, act like, and this is an invitation, not like a guilty command.
Of
Wouldn't
course.
you consider acting like I do? And that is having compassion on them. Like, of course they're mad because they were interrupted, but your job is to be a parent and to help
Hmm.
shape them in that moment and say, hey, we don't have to yell when we get interrupted. It's possible to be patient with each other. There are ways to talk this out. And even like what I'm doing in their life in that moment is exactly what God is doing in my in my life at that moment to help me learn that I don't need to yell at them. So one of my habits of discipline is these things called pause prayers, where like on the way up to that moment, and imagine this is very quick and dirty. Like I'm like saying an emergency prayer of, Lord, help me be patient like you're patient, which is like, again, small change, but major liturgy. Because if you're reminding yourself, I'm more like them than not, like in prayer on the way to a discipline moment, it does change the way you respond, especially over time. It will be that trigger that gets you like out of the angry dad mode, I'm about to explode, and into the patient father mode where you look like Jesus. And what would we call that?
Mm.
Sanctification. Like
Yeah.
he is sanctifying me through my parenting, which is entirely about it's a lot about me. It's also what he's doing in their life, but it's a lot about what
Yeah.
he's doing in my life. So I'd end with that. I mean, I think parenting is, because I could go on about this part of the topic all day. I just think parenting is one of the most sanctifying things that ever got introduced to my life.
Yeah. No, I would say, just part of my story is when I became a father, it's like in some ways, and this doesn't jip anyone that's not a father. If you're listening today, it's not like you have a second experience of God's grace
Right,
towards
right.
you. But from my experience, when I became a father in those early days, it was like you're immediately confronted with some of the areas that you just kind of want to avoid in kind of the dark corners of your life, whether it's your pride or your short temper. You know, I was shocked how terrible I was on low sleep. Like all of a sudden it's like, where did this come from? And just already unearthing those things that God wants to deal with in our hearts. And so, I just think that sanctifying work of parenting that you touch on, those pause prayers, how powerful would it be, man, if guys listening to this would just say, before I step into these moments, I just take a second to take a deep breath, which is proven to do, you know, have just a calming effect, say a prayer, and then step into those. And that's kind of like, I've heard you speak on just your reconciliation when there's like discipline happening, and just the power of like embracing and the power of hugging. And I know you had mentioned before about kind of the science behind that, but also just the power of seeing your sons come together after a moment of kind of fighting. I'd love for our hearers to hear a little bit about your discipline habit and how you kind of navigate that.
Well, I think that's a big one for dads too, because if you're like me, you can be harsh in your discipline or harsh in your temperament towards your children. And effectively what you do is like shame them in order to control their behavior, right? And so one of the things that I try to think about is, after a moment of discipline, if I am too mad to hug or tickle them, like I'm just still too stormy and upset to embrace them, sit beside them happily, or tickle them like if they're little, then I've probably gone overboard. Like I haven't dealt with my end of it, right? And if they're too mad to accept my tickles or accept my hug or sit beside me after a moment of discipline, then I've probably been too harsh on them, right? And so I use this sort of moment of usually physical encounter, which, like, if you're a dad, you should know, you should be thinking about this. Probably you already are, but like, it's a physical task. Yeah. Your sons and daughters need to know what your embrace feels like. Like, they need to know what your beard or lack of beard or like stubble, like they need to be feeling it on them. You know, physicality, like you need, that's how a lot of your love is communicated. And so I think about this after moments of discipline, and I try to work backwards and say, at the end of this, we need to be smiling and laughing. Otherwise, the work of discipline's not done, which kind of means, yes, there's going to be a moment where I tell them what they did wrong, because that's like Jesus, like we need to be dispensers of the truth and be like a loving authority. But also, like Jesus, I want to graciously call them forward and not say, like, it's not the end of your life. Like, here's how you could do better. Here's how you can follow God. Those are words, and that's important. And yes, they'll say, I'm sorry. And yes, I'll say, I forgive you. But what my whole point here is, it's just not done necessarily, because we know that those can be like, sorry, okay, I forgive you. You know, you can still be really mad and not reconciled, like not loving each other again. And so that habit of saying, like, we're going to figure out how to hug or tickle, it helps me work backwards. And again, like, it changes how I get there. Because if I know I'm going to have to tickle them at the end of this moment, I start to like act differently, you know? And for them, we call it the brother's hug. Like, if they have a fight and they need to say sorry and forgive you, then they do a brother's hug at the end, where they hug until they both smile or laugh again. And, you know, be wise with this. If you have to, you know, this works really well for younger kids. With older ones, it's more like do an activity together or sit next to each other and talk. It's helping them. And, you know, for like mom and dad, you and your wife, like, you need to figure it out too. Like, you need to figure out how to, you know, be hugging again. Or, you know, this could go farther. Like, is it makeup sex? Is it hugging again? Is it going on an outing? Like, you need to figure out this with your spouse, with your kids, with parent and child, because it is totally unsurprising that conflict happens in the house. That is a given. What is not a given is that we repair, repent, and reconcile after conflict. That's the difference between the family that grows bitter, the typical story of family, and the Christian family who grows soft because they are practicing repentance. It's a given that we're going to have these problems. What's not a given is that we repair them, and that's the real task.
Wow, I love that, man. It's this idea of the brother's hug. When I thought about that, my brother and I could have used that many years when we were younger. Justin, man, I could go on and on, but let me just finish off with this. Typically on our Impactus podcast, we just do a quick speed round, 3 or 4 questions, and you just kind of rhyme off the top of your head, kind of what comes out. Are you cool to do that?
Let's see if I can keep up. Let's go.
It's only 3 or 4. So the first one is, what new skill did you learn during the pandemic?
Oh Gosh, this is supposed to be a speed round, and I'm not sure. I got better at making fires, but I already knew how to do that. But I got really quick at them because we did a lot of backyard bonfires. So I got real. My kids also got better at kicking up a bonfire real fast. So
yeah, the key is to teach them, right? So that you don't have to do it. The best book you read in 2022.
2022. Can I give best book I read in 2021 during
Come
the
on,
pandemic?
that works. Yeah.
Okay, I'm giving the best book I read in 2021 was Endurance, and it's the story of Ernest Shackleton and his crew that go to explore Antarctica. And I think there's just and what happens on their journey. So many spiritual metaphors, and it's an incredible read called Endurance.
Awesome. And lastly, we'll make it quick. Where can people find you online?
Lots of places. Habitsofthehousehold.com to look at this book, thecommonrule.org if you want to look into the last book, or justinwhitmelearly.com if you want to look at my author stuff. But Google is your friend here. Like, Google the name of those books, Google my name, Justin Earley, and you'll find my websites. And I'm most active on social media, on Instagram. If you read my stuff, you know that I have some opinions about limiting your use of social media. So I'm not always there, but I do respond to messages there, and people can email me or get in touch with me via my website. So I'd love to hear from people.
Yeah, I would just like to say on that, his Instagram right now is fire. He's doing these theological moments of the household, and man, I'm just been eating that up. So thank you so much, Justin, and thank you for coming on today, and just really appreciate all you had to say. I'm hoping it's not the last time because I need to unpack much of what we just said. Thanks so much.
That sounds great. Well, it's been a pleasure to talk, Jordan. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. Thanks, Justin.